What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, we're having a look at one of Magnus Carlsen's very best games from the 2024 World Rapid Championships. That is before he quit from the tournament. This game is Magnus Carlsen versus Denis Kadric, again from the 2024 World Rapid Championships. And here we go. In the game, Magnus Carlsen opens 1e4, Denis goes e5, then we have knight f3 and knight to f6. And the Petroff Defense is an opening that has given Magnus Carlsen a little bit of trouble in recent years. I mean, ever since Fabiano Caruana played it against his 1e4 opening in their World Championship match, it has been a frequent guest in his games. Now here Magnus continues, knight takes e5, then d6, knight f3, so far very standard stuff, knight takes e3, and now here Magnus does go knight to c3, and we did see Magnus play this move against Jan Nepomniachtchi, the Russian grandmaster, and that game was very interesting. Now the point of knight c3 is that black does take on c3, that is the main line, then white simply goes d takes c3, typically followed by bishop e3 or f4, then queen d2 with wall castles, and he will get a very aggressive attacking setup. Now, instead, in this game, black goes knight to f6, simply retreating the knight, and this move is a little bit dubious here. Instead, knight takes c3 again is the stronger continuation and the main line. Now we have d4, then bishop d7, very interesting, black opting not to go d5. Of course, if he went d5 in one go, for example, d5 here, then white is effectively up 2 tempo. Otherwise, it is a symmetrical position. He has that knight on c3, he can go bishop d3 and short castles and so on, and those 2 extra tempos do give him a very good initiative in that symmetrical position. Now, instead of that here, right here, bishop e7 played by black, now we have bishop d3, and now simply short castles. All right, so far so good. Magnus continues, h3, guarding the g4 square, stopping knight g4 and bishop g4 ideas. Very solid. Black goes rook e8, white castles, and now here, black has played pretty much all of the standard moves. Bishop e7, short castles, rook e8, and so on. And finally, he will have to decide on some sort of plan. And the main problem, of course, is those queenside pieces. How does he want to develop his queenside and get the rest of his pieces into the game? Well, he has many different options here. For example, knight to c6 immediately is playable. Beyond that, d5 is playable. Even b6 and tending bishop b7 is playable. But instead of those options in the game here, black did go knight bd7, a perfectly solid move, but now his pieces are tripping over each other a little bit. For example, you can't go knight f6 or e5 or c5 yet, and going knight b6 would be sort of an awkward placement for that knight. So we'll have to wait and see what black has in mind here. All right, Magnus, he continues. Rook to e1, a very standard move in the Petroff opening, taking control of the open e-file with the rook. Now here, it turns out, when you go knight bd7, the best way to continue is simply b6 and tending bishop b7, as overall, you are cutting off the light square bishop on this diagonal anyway. Therefore, b6 and bishop b7 is the right way forward. Now here, black makes his second major mistake of the game. The first one, of course, going knight f6 on move 5 instead of knight takes c3. The second mistake here is going h6, and this move is a little bit slow. I mean, it doesn't do a whole lot for black's position. Yes, bishop g5 was possible, but overall, that move wasn't really that dangerous, and h6 is just an unnecessary wasted move from black, again, delaying that b6, bishop b7 plan that is much stronger in this position. Now here, Magnus, he continues, a4, gaining space on the queen side. Very interesting. And now, of course, Magnus is threatening potentially a5 and a6 later in the game if black is not careful. For example, if black goes, say, I don't know, bishop f8 or b6, then a5 immediately would be quite strong for Magnus. So with that in mind here, a5 played by black, immediately clamping down on the queenside pawns. And of course now, white will have a much harder time gaining space on the queen side later in the game. All right, here, Magnus, it continues. Bishop f4, developing his bishop. And so far, the position for both sides is pretty symmetrical. Yes, Magnus does have a little bit of a space advantage. That d4 pawn gives him more space than the black counterpart on d6, and his pieces are a little bit more active. For example, the bishop on f4 being more active than the one on e7, the bishop on d3 being more active than the one on c8, but overall, black is doing relatively okay so far in the game. Now, it turns out here the strongest plan for black in the spirit of the Berlin defense against the Ruy Lopez is simply going c6 and tending d5. And again, black is a little bit slower in his development, but overall he is doing just fine, and he should be relatively okay. Now, instead of that here, black does go bishop f8, challenging white's control of the open e-file. Now here, what does Magnus want to do? Of course, queen d2 is possible. That way, if black takes on e1, you can recapture with the other rook, maintaining control of the open e-file with the rook. Now, instead of that here, rook takes e8 was played in the game, trading the rooks, then queen takes, and then here it turns out Magnus has a very interesting option to gain even more space on the queen side and get sort of a queenside initiative going. That is the sequence knight b5, threatening knight takes c7, forcing out queen d8 from black, and then you go c4 as the pawn is no longer blockaded on c2. That would be a very interesting way to get the c4 break in, gaining space on the queen side. Now, instead of that here, Magnus, he is in no rush. He just goes queen d2, maintaining good control of position. And of course, the threat is simply rook e1, developing the rook with tempo and gaining control of the e-file as the queen on e8 would have to move. All right, now here, black, how should he proceed? Well, it turns out the computer here actually likes the idea of knight to b6. The point being, the knight is decently placed there, and it does open up this diagonal for the bishop, but overall, I'm not that big of a fan of knight b6 from a human standpoint. Instead here, black does go c6, intending d5, trying to gain more space in the center. Perfectly logical. Now here, Magnus goes rook e1, hitting the queen, queen d8, gets out of the attack. And now here, how does Magnus want to continue? Well, it's actually kind of hard to gain space on the queen side. Now that c6 is played, knight b5 is not possible. And overall, again, moving those queenside pawns won't be easy. Now here, the computer loves the idea of going g4, gaining space on the king side, and Magnus Carlsen has won a lot of games in the 5 rook e1 variation against the Berlin defense of the Roy Lopez with this sort of plan. Once the game gets very symmetrical after black goes d5, Magnus often goes, for example, g4, king g2, and so on, slowly creeping and gaining more space on the king side. Now in this game, instead of that, he just goes bishop g3, and this move kind of surprised me. It does block the g-pawn. g4 is now obviously not possible as that pawn on g2 is blockaded by the own bishop, but overall, Magnus is still doing just fine. Now here, black should likely go d5, gaining space in the center, then trying to find something to do with this knight on d7, but instead here, he actually goes queen to b6, hitting that pawn on b2 as well as the pawn on d4. Now, obviously, white is going to have to deal with this threat. He doesn't want to lose a pawn. But in reality, that pawn on d4 is not being threatened by the queen yet. For example, if white goes simply b3, defending the pawn on b2, and black takes on d4 with the queen, then there is literally the oldest trick in the book, bishop h7, hitting the king with check, and then you take the undefended queen on d4. So, despite looking like a double attack, the queen is only really hitting b2. d4 is not really being threatened yet due to that bishop h7 tactic. All right, now here, white, how does he want to continue? Well, there are many good moves here. For example, b3 again, defending b2 is playable, queen c1 is playable, and so on. But in the game, Magnus plays a very interesting move, knight to h4. I quite like this move. Jumping up with the knight, threatening knight to f5 ideas. That knight would be very strong on f5, and beyond that, if white ever gets bishop c4 in, then knight g6 could even be a threat as well. All right, now here, black, how should he continue? Well, technically, queen takes b2 is possible, but that is not a move you want to make. And here's why. If black goes queen takes b2, then the response is rook b1, gaining control of the b-file. Black has to move the queen to a3, and then you can slide the queen back to e1, gaining control of the e-file with the queen. The queens and the rooks are lining up all these open files. Then you can go knight f5, and overall, you have a huge initiative for that single pawn investment. So, obviously, queen takes b2 is not the right move here, and instead, black plays a different move, queen to b4. Now, this move is a little bit dubious. What is the queen doing on b4 that it wasn't doing on b6? Instead of this, queen d8, retreating the queen, it turns out, is the strongest move here for black. Instead, queen b4, and again, you're not threatening d4 yet due to bishop h7, and if you wanted to capture the pawn on b2, why wouldn't you do it right away? Overall, this move is just a little bit dubious, and here Magnus, he is not slowing down. He just jumps in with the knight to f5. Now, that knight is an absolute monster on f5. I believe Gary Kasparov once said the knight on f5 is worth at least a pawn, and that is supported here as the fact that white is up over a pawn according to the engine here. The point being the knight is eyeing so many different squares, d6, g7, h6, and so on, and overall that knight is just spearheading the attack against the black king. All right, black continues. Knight b6, the best square for the knight, threatening knight d5, centralizing the knight, and beyond that, of course, the bishop is now pressuring that knight on f5. It may want to go bishop takes f5 very fast, as again, that knight is just too strong to be kept alive. All right, now here, in this position, white has An absolutely insane tactical shot. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find this beautiful shot by Magnus Carlsen that he has available right here. All right, here, the key idea for white, believe it or not, is simply knight takes h6, giving up the knight for a single pawn. And according to the engine, the attack is worth the entire knight investment. Here's how the main line goes. I'm going to run through it real fast. Knight takes h6, then g takes, then all you have to do is bishop f4, threatening to win a pawn. And it turns out, honestly, the attack is worth more than the piece investment. White can go bishop takes h6, rook e3, rook g3, and so on. And one of the key facts here is the queen on b4 is just so far away from the defense of the black king that white's attack is just devastating. So overall, knight takes a6 would have been a brilliant idea. Instead here, Magnus plays a much simpler option, knight e7. He's not risking things. He's got a huge lead. He's doing just fine. And now here, the best move for black is simply bishop takes e7, giving up the very important dark squared bishop to knock off that knight. Now, instead here, king to h8 was played, and this allows that knight on e7 to live. That is not a good idea at all. Magnus is going to get a huge attack thanks to that knight on e7. All right, here, Magnus, he continues. Queen to f4, increasing the pressure. Now, obviously, queen takes d6 is being threatened as the bishop is no longer controlling d6. What is black going to do about it? Well, here he continues. Bishop e6, trying to defend, but now here Magnus, he doesn't take on d6. Instead, he finds a much more savage move. He plays the move knight to g6. What is the idea? Well, it's very simple. If you take the knight on g6, then white takes the bishop on e6, not to mention the fact that black's kingside pawn structure will be severely damaged. The white bishop on d3 will be targeting the new pawn on g6, and overall, white will have a devastating attack. So instead of taking on g6, here black does go king to g6, try to defend, but white is not done. Here he goes, knight takes f8, trading off the very important defensive piece, that being the dark squared bishop on f8. All right, now rook takes f8, then queen takes d6. Here Magnus is officially up a pawn. If you trade queens as black, I mean, you're going into the endgame down a pawn against the greatest endgame player of all time. That is when he doesn't quit tournaments midway through. That means that would not be a good idea at all. Now here, what should black be doing? Obviously, queen takes d6 is not the right way forward. Well, you can take on b2, and beyond that, maybe you want to go rook e8 or bishop c4, trying to trade off bishops. Now in the game, black plays queen takes b2. That is perhaps the most enterprising move, the best practical choice. Of course, you are putting pressure on the knight on c3. You do win back a pawn, but now the problem, the queen is just so far away from the defense of the king. And here Magnus finds yet another beautiful tactical shot. Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the beautiful move played by Magnus right here. All right, here on move 24, Magnus Carlsen plays the rook sacrifice / exchange sacrifice, whatever you want to call it, Chess YouTube. Rook takes e6. I know you guys love to roast me in the comments for calling it a rook sacrifice, but you're giving up the rook for lesser material. To me, that is a rook sacrifice. Just like a queen traded for a rook and a knight is a queen sacrifice. You wouldn't say it's the queen for a rook and a knight sacrifice, but I digress. All right, the rook sacrifice, rook takes e6. Now here, black, can he take on c3? Well, he technically can, but that would not be a good idea at all. Instead, you simply have to win that rook on e6 right away. So f takes e6 played in the game. Now knight to e4, jumping over with the knight. And of course now everything on the queen side is defended, that being the pawn on c3, the pawn on d4, and so on. And Magnus, his goal is just to pile up the pressure on the king side as soon as he can before black can get his queen over to the defense. All right, now here, what's the best way forward for black? Well, turns out the best move is knight bd7, trying to get more pieces over to the king side as soon as you can. Now, instead of that here, if you take on e4, that is a massive mistake. White simply goes queen takes e4, rook f7 blocks the check, and then queen takes e4, threatening queen h7 ideas. That would be devastating. Now, instead of knight bd7, the strongest move, or knight takes e4, the weakest move here, black does go knight bd5, and this move is sort of in between. It's a little bit dubious. It doesn't help that much, but it's also not immediately losing. All right, here, Magnus the GOAT, he continues. Queen takes e6, winning the free pawn. Then we have king to h8, and then knight to d6, jumping up with the knight. All right, what is black going to do? Well, turns out queen takes d4 is the right move, winning back that free pawn on d4 immediately, and very importantly, trying to get your queen back into the game. That queen is just too strong to be left stranded on b2. Now, instead here, black plays a very dubious idea, knight to b4, jumping over with the knight to the queen side. Doesn't black know you have to get all your pieces over to the king side to defend? This was a major tactical and strategic error. I really don't know what he was thinking. Now, the idea, obviously, maybe I am being a little bit too harsh here. The idea, he wants to trade off that light square bishop on d3. Knight takes d3 is being threatened, but here, Magnus, he just continues, queen d7, threatening the rook on e7. What is black going to do? He continues rook to a8, but now here Magnus, he continues chasing that rook. Queen takes b7, hits the rook on a8. The rook has to move once again, rook to f8, and then queen e7 once again, and now the rook runs away again, rook to a8. Black is just hoping for a draw. He's hoping for the draw by repetition, but of course Magnus knows he has no need for that. He just continues, knight f7, hitting the king. The king has to move as the knight cannot be taken. King g8 played in the game, and now here we have yet another beautiful tactical shot by Magnus. If you like puzzles again, pause the video, try to find this one. Here, Magnus does go knight takes h6, giving up the knight on the h6 square for the pawn. What is the idea? Well, if you take the knight, g takes h6, then white takes the knight on f6, so a temporary knight sacrifice. You do win the knight back immediately if you take. Now, instead of that, the best move for black here is simply king to h8. You don't want to take that knight. It just damages the pawn structure on the king side way too much. Instead here, black does take on h6, g takes h6, and now, of course, queen takes f6 played for Magnus, and here black is just, he is not long for this world. White's attack is just speeding up exponentially. All right, here black, he tries to defend. Knight takes d3. That being the obvious idea of knight b4 played earlier in the game, but it is just simply not enough here. Magnus continues, queen g6, hitting the king. Now king h8. Now he picks at the free pawn. Queen takes h6. Now, real fast, let's do inventory here. If white takes back that knight on d3, obviously it is black's turn to move. You know what? King g8 played in the game. Now, obviously, if white takes back on d3, the material is going to be in his favor. He will have the bishop, and let's count them. Literally 1, 2, 3, 4 extra pawns for the rook. That would be more than enough material, but the very important factor here, white also has the devastating attack against the black king. The material balance and the attack, that is just too much. Here, white continues. Queen g6, king h8, queen f6, king g8, and here white simply takes on d3. C takes d3, and in this position, believe it or not, black, he simply resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Here's why. Almost no matter what you do, white is going to go bishop to e5, threatening queen g7, checkmate, and it's going to be almost impossible to stop the attack. And even if you do, let's say the queens, the rooks, and the bishops all get flying off the board, white's going to have too many extra pawns in the endgame. I'm going to pull up the top engine line real fast for you guys. I want to show you what it would be. Here, the computer says queen b7 is the best defense, and then let's see what it says here. Yeah, bishop e5 is too strong, queen h7 from black, then simply queen takes c6 and so on. Again, white is just winning too much material. It is just too much. And for that reason here, his opponent, Denis Kadrik, he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen right here. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where I cover yet another one of Magnus Carlsen's best games from the 2024 World Rapid Chess Championships. That is before he decided to voluntarily quit from the tournament, before he had a very bad day 1 and day 2. And that's all I got, so I'll see you in the next video.